Does the red teamer know this is a blue summit? Is he uncomfortable around this many defenders? And the answer to that question is no. At the end of the day, we are on the same team, and that's kind of the foundation of this talk, is pushing to you guys. We may approach things differently, but at the end of the day, we have a different perspective that adds to that defender profile. So hopefully through this talk, I will cover, from the red team perspective, tips, tricks, advice that might help you as a defender. So obviously, I am at MITRE, and we use ATT&CK all the time, so a lot of my talk will be grounded in ATT&CK. If you're unfamiliar with ATT&CK, we'll go through it in the beginning, as well as a lot of the history of ATT&CK, if you're unfamiliar with this, is based on this same type of conversation. So red teamers talking to blue teamers and realizing there is a need to connect those gaps and be able to universally communicate about behaviors and adversary ideas. The rest of this talk is structured into 4 main points. The 4 points being the categories of advice from a red teamer to a blue teamer to achieve that goal we were talking about. And obviously, let's have some fun, let's laugh, have a good time. I'm really excited to be turned into a meme, so looking forward to that. Without further ado, okay, so what is ATT&CK? ATT&CK is our knowledge base of adversary behaviors. And by behaviors, we're not talking about the realm of the possible, or more scoping to what real adversaries are doing. So everything is based on actual reported intelligence on what adversaries have done in the real world. A lot of the questions we get sometimes are, how do I buy ATT&CK? How do I plug in? Where is it? Good news, publicly available. Everything's free. We give it away. URL's there. Not only can you check out all of our content, but we reference the actual ground truth intelligence that we use to populate that. So you're able to check out, our perspective and our analysis of it, as well as the sources reaching out to various CTI producers that actually provided intelligence that laid the foundation for our framework. Major point here is ATT&CK is community-driven. So it's not just, from MITRE's standpoint, sitting on a high horse telling you what adversaries are doing, but we're also taking feedback and contributions from the community. So as you see there, we have our email address and our Twitter, where we're always looking for, you as defenders, what do you see happening in your environments? What do you want to see populated or changed about MITRE ATT&CK that makes it more useful for you? So one of the things I mentioned in the last slide was our obsession and our focus on behaviors. And this is a great mechanism that we use to describe, why exactly we're doing that. If you're unfamiliar with this, this is David Bianco's pyramid of pain. Basically, the idea is this is a way of looking at indicators of compromise. So starting at the bottom, things like hash values, moving all the way up to what we call TTPs, or in our world, behaviors. The idea behind this is things at the bottom of the pyramid are maybe easy or trivial to collect. IOCs and hashes are, those static values are bouncing around. They're easy to ingest into tools, but what's the pain you're really inflicting on the adversary there? In this case, it's pretty trivial as a red teamer. If you're hashing my tools, I can get around that. Like we talked about earlier, the magic of the compiler, recompile it, change a couple bits here and there, I'm past it. The idea behind ATT&CK, though, is if we can move up this pyramid to the TTP level, the behaviors, what at a foundational level, what an adversary is actually doing, you're more equipped and better suited to produce less brittle and more resilient detections. So yeah, that is where, as ATT&CK, that's where we're hoping to aim. So breaking down ATT&CK. If you've ever seen our content, the most popular picture of the way we render ATT&CK is what we call the framework, or the matrix. So just to give you insight, I've decomposed the framework here to help you understand the way it fits together, and this kind of helps you visualize what exactly we're aiming for here. So the first concept is what we call tactics. So going across the top, we have basically what an adversary is trying to achieve, or their goal in the environment. This may look similar to a kill chain, but it's not linear. There's no prescribed order. This is just, as an adversary is maneuvering in your environment, a way to think about, what are they trying to actually do? Coming down from each one of those tactics, we have what we call techniques. This is the hows. This is how an adversary is trying to actually achieve that goal. So for example, if you look at initial access, there are various ways that an adversary could do that, sending various types of spear phishing, sending links, adding new hardware, using valid accounts, etc. And within each technique, we have what we call procedures. These are documented ways that an adversary has actually executed that technique. And this is kind of getting closer to that real feel and that real threat intelligence vibe of what makes ATT&CK useful. So why attack? You know, why would I buy into this? Why am I trying to sell this to you and pitch this as a great idea? We've received much feedback about like why attack is useful, but at the end of the day, the biggest story is that common language. Like I said before, even within a red team talking to each other, or red to blue, or your lowly SOC analyst up to your C-suite, it is vital that you're able to communicate, you know, consistently what adversaries are doing. We've also seen this adoption within tools, whether it's your SIEM, your network appliance, all those tools, if they're able to correlate things and, you know, trace it back to a single technique ID that correlates and moves through your appliance is much easier. Okay, so getting into the meat and potatoes, insights from a red teamer to a blue teamer, or the defense community in general, on things we've noticed that may be helpful for your pursuit in defense. Biggest first one is treat me like an adversary. So sometimes, I know there's a compliance and reasons that, you know, often more times than not, assessments, engagements, whatever you call them, are treated as checkboxes. You know, this is something we had to do, it's a necessary evil, maybe you drag your feet through it. Our methodology or our approach here is that rather than that, you should be treating it as an opportunity to grow, you know, research things. The analogy we always use is sparring. You know, boxers don't just walk in the ring and fight their opponent. They practice, they learn things, and as they kind of like build up, they iterate and they learn and they improve their technique so that when the actual day comes that they're facing their real adversary, they're that much more informed and aware of how you'll actually perform. The biggest threshold, or I guess bottleneck we see on this is a lot of engagements don't really include the necessary level of transparency. So both teams talking to each other and saying, you know, this is exactly what we're doing, what we're expecting, can you test that? And a big, I guess, blocker to that is trust. There needs to be inherent trust between everyone involved. And to highlight this point, this is a great picture we borrow from Red Canary. They have a really, we've been introduced to that a couple times today, but basically the idea behind this iterative testing, you know, develop a test, execute the test and see what happens, capture the results, study that and understand, you know, is this where you want to be, and iterate. Keep going that process over and over again until you get to the point where you're comfortable with what is produced. So the example I'm going to work through here is cred dumping. You know, as we discussed today many times, adversaries more times than not need credentials in their environment. They'll dump creds various typical ways, but a start to detecting this may be, you know, start with a Mimikat hash. You know, go to the GitHub page, download it, hash it, apply it in your environment and see, you know, are we detecting that? And just provide that to the red team and say, hey, can you get past this? Can you dump creds without triggering this alert? Well, more than likely than not, yes, they can. Like you said, the magic of the compiler, easily subverted, next problem. So, you know, iteration 2 may be strings. You know, take some of the strings from the binary, you know, apply that more of a heuristic approach, and can this be bypassed? Well, absolutely, absolutely. Like we talked about before, obfuscation, different procedures of dumping credentials, all bypassable. That process, like I alluded, can be continued over and over again until you get to the point where you're something more at the behavior level. So in this case, you know, a process creating that is a high integrity process, that the next step it does is an actual credential read or an access to LSAS. So even this can be bypassed, but as you noted, or you probably noticed, that is a little bit closer to the actual behavior or the nuances of the technique rather than these like static values that are produced as a consequence. Next point here would be, you know, ground your assessment or engagement results in intelligence. One of the things we often hear is that, you know, someone gets a report on what the red team did and they read it, but they say, you know, how practical is this? Like, is this really something we can act on? And the answer to that question is absolutely. One of the words that floats around in our space is adversarial emulation, and we interpret that as taking your red team and applying that cyber threat intelligence on what real adversaries are doing and using that to both scope what your red team is going to do as well as, you know, codifying and organizing the results. And that does address quite like those questions I talked about before about practicality, you know, how real or how tangible are these results? So one of the resources we have to help you with this is called the Attack Navigator. And if you notice this, and this is available on our GitHub, the source is available as well as we host it at that URL. Basically, the idea here is that we provide a flat attack matrix for you to provide your own overlays or coloring or, you know, provide your own data on top. So an example of what I'm talking about with grounding this red engagement with intelligence is start here and say, this overlay is produced from what APT-28 has been documented to do. So this is a real threat adversary. Take your red team, deliver to this to them, and say, I want you to perform these actions or behaviors in our environment. Next step would be perform it and capture the results. From a red or from a blue perspective, provide another overlay on what was actually observed, so you get that hit or miss product. This is what red did, this is what blue did, this is our misses, this is what we saw. Another enrichment of that could be, of the things we saw, how confident are we in those? Yellow being, things that we detected, but we're maybe not sure or we're not confident that we'll always detect that, or we just, in general, don't like the results that were produced. Green being, based on what we saw, we're pretty confident that that's really not something urgent or something that we need to address in terms of criticality. So something like that, taking that and applying it going forward is really important, because very often not, we see these engagement results, these long red team reports being lost in translation. Someone reads it, they tuck it in a folder, end of story. But applying that intelligence thread to it and overlaying everything actually can help you, as you saw on the last slide, prioritize things going forward. Looking at, well, what did the red team do and what do we need to address going forward? Maybe greens are things that we're not super concerned about. Yellow are things that if we have time, we'll take a look at it. Red are things we absolutely missed, and that's things we need to hop on. Big point, another point here is, like I said, the greens maybe not things that you need to urgently jump on, but going forward, adversaries grow. Adversaries go to DEF CON, adversaries go to Black Hat, they invent new techniques and new ways of doing things. So just because something's green now doesn't mean it'll stay that way. So going forward, you might be comfortable with what happened in the last engagement, but maybe there's a new way to do that same procedure. Maybe there's changes in your environment going forward that may change the detection or how you feel about what was produced from detecting that procedure. So start thinking about that, and one of the big things that we've seen being very successful in practice is taking the output of a red team report and giving it as input to the next iteration, saying, this is what the last red team did, and this is the result, and this is how we interpret it. Can you redo all this stuff and change the green things, because we were pretty comfortable how we detected that, but on the yellow and red, maybe redo it and make sure that the things that we've done since then have actually produced value. And final point on this category is red teaming and testing is not purely a red function. There are many resources and many approaches that you can test these things on your own. We have a couple resources here. The MITRE produces what we call the Caldera project. It's an automated red team capability. Basically, it's an agent you install, and it will run an automated red team against your box. There's also, we produced what we call adversary emulation plans. So basically, it's a 2-document summary of what this particular adversary does in terms of what are their motivations, what tools they use, and what behaviors that translate to, as well as a cheat sheet. So basically, an Excel document saying, if you want to test, X behavior or technique in the style of this APT, copy and paste this command and run it. Very similar to the bottom link is the Red Canary Atomic Red Teaming project. So next category, know your capabilities. This is a big thing. On the red side, we obviously obsess with this, but on the blue side, I think it's very advantageous as well. Know where and what you're detecting or collecting, as well as that data coming in, what are you doing with it? Are you running it through analytics? Are you logging it? Where is it going? And most importantly, what is the output of that process? Are you throwing alerts in your face that would help you identify, something bad has happened? Is it being come to you? As well as these alerts are coming in and you're taking a look at all this bad, are there other things that maybe false positives and such that are getting in the way and maybe flooding your inbox? So it's really important not, like I said before, not to just deploy an analytic, it sounds good, I think this will work, and not actually test and understand, operationally, how can this fire true positives, what are the false positives of this, and then operationally, what are processes of understanding and reacting to those alerts. And this is a process or a problem we recently addressed if you're familiar with attack evaluation. So basically what we did is we developed a 2-day script based on APT3 and ran this against vendors who set up their EDR products. And this is an example of the results we produced, but the most important thing here is we documented not only what the capability detected or the detection that was produced, but also the procedure. So if you look at the far left, we say, this is what the red team actually did, and this is how this maps to known behaviors adversaries are doing, and also mapping granularly at that atomic level what the actual capabilities produced in terms of detections and output. And this is a crucial way of, like you said, or like I was saying before, taking a look at, what you deployed and what you're expecting of it, and actually validating and verifying that, what you think is going to happen and what will happen are truly match up, and then, addressing that delta. Next thing is, like you said, once you understand, where your detections are and what you can expect, you have a really good sense of what you can expect, where are your holes. We call this the false negative problem. As a defender, you really don't know what you're gonna miss until it happens. So doing an evaluation and assessment like this is really vital to taking a look at, what are those holes, and more importantly, what are you gonna do when you get an incomplete detection or one of these holes are actually hit? Do you kill processes, do you quarantine the host, or do you unplug things and start breaking stuff with bats just to, remediate the problem? Next category, decompose behaviors. So like I said before, attack is a framework for taking an adversary and decomposing it into individual behaviors, but there is another step beyond that. So taking a look at what an actual behavior is, the way we think about it often is, from our side, we're looking for OPSEC reasons, but as a defender, you can take a look at behavior and say, well, there's really 3 stages of doing something. There's the building up the requirements, or all the prerequisites that are required for that behavior to take place. There's the actual mechanics of the behavior, so what happens when the behavior is being executed, as well as the artifacts. What's left over, what are the residual artifacts that are a byproduct of that behavior. So the visualization here is mapping those 3 stages to sysmon events. So the requirement, the prerequisites be things like drivers being loaded, images being loaded, whatever is about to produce the behavior, gathering the necessary code and resources that it needs. Step 2, the mechanics. So these would be process being created, whatever the mechanics of the behavior is, remote threads, process accesses, whatever it may be, and then process terminates. So the actual meat and potatoes or execution of that behavior. And then the residual part would be things like leftover network connections or logs of network connections, file creates, whether it was intentional or it was something temporary, like a residual temp file or something, or finally like data spillage, those things that some behaviors write things to registry, or like if it's intentional, like some type of persistence, things that are left behind. So taking a look at a behavior at this micro scale is really important to understand, as you look at a detection and as you see the output of what you detected, understanding where do you fall in this chain and kind of tracing it either forward or back to see there are other parts that we could have addressed and maybe supplement that full detection with different parts or aspects of the same behavior. This concept also actually scales out to the macro scale. So not just looking at an individual behavior, but looking at a chain of behaviors. We call this like the storyline approach. More often than not, you can infer from an adversary's behavior what they're trying to do. So say they're scanning for certain port numbers, or they're looking in certain file directories for certain files. You can kind of infer, if they're looking for this, I can kind of tell what they're trying to do. And that might be insightful going forward on, what's the next, if the chain that we're trying or the thread that we're pulling comes up dry, what's the next step or jump I can make to kind of get back on track with where the adversary is. There's different approaches to this. One of my colleagues, Andy Applebaum, actually released a blog, and the URL is in the bottom, on 2 different ways of doing this. The way I described is what he calls the semantic approach, saying, adversary is looking for this, so they must be doing this. There's also what he calls a data-driven approach to this. So saying, taking a bunch of intelligence that you gather and saying, how often does an adversary who uses PowerShell also use something like WMI? And understanding, operationally, if you see this, what are the most common things or most likely things that you should also be looking for, just based on, trends and behaviors in the wild. Next category, know your environment better than I do. Like we discussed many times today, the real world and what you actually see in a real environment is often messy and what we call weird. Like that was one of the biggest problems we see as we transition between tabletop exercise and real engagements, is people, they understand, what adversaries do, and they write all these fancy analytics and all these sensors and all these protections, but when they deploy it into an environment, they realize their actual real users are doing these same behaviors non-maliciously. So one of the things that we've noticed is the actual threshold between adversary and a normal user is very often intent. Is the normal user intending to do something malicious, or is it an adversary actually trying to achieve a tactic? And this is really important because as a defender, more often than not, your appliances will be lighting up with alerts if you start taking a deeper dive into this stuff. But being able to look at those alerts and understand, what's normal, what's weird, it'll help you kind of streamline that process of IR or triaging real alerts or incidents. So I'm going to ask for a little audience participation here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through a process tree. And at some point, or any point in the process tree where you think or you are sure that this is a malicious behavior, give me a thumbs down just so I can kind of get a feel on everyone's threshold. So first, top of the tree, explorer.exe. Any takers? Okay, expected. Yeah, I'm fine with that as well. This is obviously a GUI Windows environment. Users like to click on things. Explorer is a pretty common process. Spawning off that, outlook.exe. Fair as well. I didn't really expect anything there as well. Users who typically use GUI, they check email as a normal business function. Coming out of Outlook, WinWord. So this is Microsoft Word's binary. Okay, awesome. Same as well. I didn't really expect anything. Next step would be WScript. There may be an embedded script, VBA, something coming off that Word attachment from the Outlook email that is doing something. Anyone there? Okay, looks like we got a couple popping up, yeah. I'm not a big fan of, embedded content in documents, but that's just my paranoia. Next, run DL32. So this embedded script from this Word document is now attempting to perhaps load something into memory. Okay, same couple thumbs here and there. Okay, fair. And from there, PowerShell spawning, adversaries, compressing and encrypting things and pushing it up to a Tor node. Point here being, this may look malicious. Like I said, if this is, your dad in South Central Chicago, this is probably malicious. But this is a developer taking a look at, understanding the Tor infrastructure and network nodes. This actually might be legitimate behavior. So it's really important as a defender that you be able to not only recognize these things, but have a more context as you look at this and understand, is this something that should be happening? Is this something that we actually need to respond to? Or is this something that, Jim does every Thursday and I should just ignore it? Or, maybe we should alert on it and maybe it's not the best hygiene, but it's something we necessarily don't need to devote resources to. Final point on this one is be proactive. Like I was kind of implying throughout this entire step. Don't wait for bad to come to you. Don't depend on your analytics and your alerts to inform you on what's happening. Go out and flip some stones over. Understand what's really happening in your environment to build a better picture of, what should be happening as well as what's really happening and, address that delta. And there's another great resource here from Roberto Rodriguez. It's called the Threat Hunters Playbook. It's available on that GitHub. Basically, the idea is it goes through a lot of known adversary behaviors based on the attack framework and gives you, what if an adversary was to do this behavior, what you should expect and what you can look for. So this might be a good exercise, as a training exercise or a boring Friday afternoon, is to go through your environment and start looking for these artifacts and these behaviors and see what turns up and apply that knowledge back to your sensing, detecting, as well as your understanding of your environment. Conclusion, so circling back to those 4 main points. Iterate and innovate. Don't treat your assessments, engagements as just like something you have to do, or you're not really interested in it, or it's just an audit, a checkbox that we just have to do every so often. Treat it as an opportunity to learn about what the work that you've been doing as a defender, what it actually produces, and how it stacks up against real adversary behavior, and take all those lessons learned and apply it going forward in a way to improve and get better. Understanding your strengths and weaknesses, your gaps. So, and more importantly, how that applies to your role and function as a defender. It's really important to understand, as you deploy things, what it actually looks like, what the output is going to look like, as well as if you miss things, what are you actually going to do about it. Next, we call this idea threat-informed defense, but think like an adversary. Anytime you make any decision based on security, whether it's operational or strategic, take a second and think, from an adversary's perspective, what would they think or react to if they saw this? And maybe that informs or twists or massages your decision just ever so slightly. But that idea of keeping in the back of your mind, how an adversary would actually treat this decision or whatever it is, if it's something material or a policy, whatever it may be, constantly, or it's advantageous to always think about the adversary perspective on things. And lastly, obviously, environments can be messy. As a red teamer, you can't say how many times you get into an environment and you think it's going to be a straightforward path to the DC, and you find out there's a bunch of stuff in the way, and you think it looks malicious, you see things happening that really shouldn't, but you find out these are just developers and admins doing their normal functions. Same thing applies to the defensive side. What you think should be happening versus what is really happening in the real world can differ greatly. So the more you are familiar with your own environment, the more you're suited to detect and sense things and make better decisions. I'm going to leave this slide up here. These are links to a lot of our attack resources. So like I said before, the attack content is available at attack.mitre.org. We also have our Medium, where we release periodically blogs and insights from our teams. We can be reached if you have any feedback on terms of content, use cases. We're always happy to hear about how you guys are using Attack. You can reach out to us on our email, attack@mitre.org, as well as our Twitter account. Thank you for your time, and appreciate it.